success to the future. It's all coming together just as planned.
Lucas Hartwell was a name that commanded respect, envy, and awe in New York's bustling business scene. At just 28, Lucas had risen from a promising tech startup founder to a full-blown young millionaire, someone who seemed to have everything. This included a luxurious penthouse with a sweeping view of Manhattan, a collection of sleek supercars, designer suits tailored to perfection, and connections that could open any door. With charm, money, and an air of self-assurance, he was the center of attention at every high-profile gala and charity fundraiser, always surrounded by admiration. Yet, despite the world of luxury he inhabited, Lucas held a certain disregard for those he viewed as less capable or less ambitious. He believed that wealth was not just a symbol of personal success, but a reflection of personal worth. In his mind, anyone who struggled financially must have lacked either intelligence or drive, and he never hesitated to voice his disdain for those who were weak enough to end up on the streets. Life was black and white to Lucas. You were either a winner like him, or a nobody. But in a single night, everything Lucas had worked for, and everything he stood for, would collapse in front of him. Lucas had always trusted Marcus, a friend he'd known since college, as a trusted confidant and business partner. Together, they had tackled countless tech ventures, many of which had paid off handsomely. So when Marcus pitched a new, life-changing investment, Lucas didn't hesitate. In fact, he went all in, investing every bit of his wealth into this project. Lucas viewed it as the golden ticket, an opportunity that would propel them both to new heights, solidifying his position not only as a millionaire, but a self-made legend. However, only a few weeks after the transfer, Marcus vanished without a trace, and along with Marcus went the entirety of Lucas's fortune. It wasn't just his savings that disappeared. Lucas's accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and within days, his prized penthouse and cars were repossessed by the bank. The friends who had once celebrated at his lavish parties drifted away as his status dissolved. Lucas found himself alone and devastated, realizing that the connections he had prided himself on were nothing more than shallow acquaintances. Everything he had once owned, everyone he had thought he knew, was slipping away faster than he could comprehend. At first, Lucas struggled to grasp what had happened. He was in disbelief, unable to fathom the sudden reversal of fortune. How could someone he trusted, someone he considered his closest ally, betray him in such a profound way? Night after night, Lucas tried desperately to contact Marcus, hoping for an explanation, a sign that this was some mistake. But with each unanswered call, the reality began to sink in. Marcus had planned it all, had targeted him with precision, and had left him utterly bankrupt. After the last call failed, Lucas sank to his knees in his empty penthouse, feeling the crushing weight of loss settle over him. The sleek furniture and expensive art pieces that once adorned his home had been sold off. This penthouse, once a symbol of his success, was now stripped down, leaving him with nothing but his regrets. He was told to vacate the place within hours. The world he had worked tirelessly to build was now nothing but a painful memory, reduced to ashes by one act of betrayal. With no money, no shelter, and no friends willing to lend a hand, Lucas found himself out on the cold city streets. Initially, he tried to keep up appearances, to cling to his last shreds of pride. He wore the same suit he had left in, but as days passed, his clothes began to look more worn, his hair unkempt. He drifted through the city in a daze, too proud to ask for help, but too desperate to know where else to turn. As days turned into nights on the streets, Lucas tasted firsthand the bitterness of poverty. The luxury and security he once took for granted now felt like a dream, fading further each time he walked past familiar places. Glancing enviously at people who walked by without a second thought, he noticed how people avoided eye contact, how they veered away from him. And with each indifferent glance, Lucas was reminded of his own attitude toward those he once deemed unworthy. He was invisible, as unimportant as those he had once dismissed. The weight of shame and despair crushed him, stripping away every last vestige of confidence. For the first time in his life, Lucas was not in control. He had nothing left to protect him from the cold reality of life without wealth. No buffer to shield him from the realization that he was just as vulnerable, just as human, as those he had once looked down upon. Yet, even as despair consumed him, Lucas held on to one last piece of his pride. He couldn't bring himself to beg, to ask strangers for change or sympathy. That, he felt, was a line he could not cross. Even as hunger gnawed him and fatigue set in, he would rather suffer than admit that he was one of them. But reality was harsh and unrelenting. In the back of his mind, Lucas knew he couldn't survive like this forever. He was cold, exhausted, and his once proud appearance was barely recognizable in his reflection. The desperation he had fought so hard to ignore was beginning to overtake him, whispering that he was no longer the man he once was, that everything he had once valued was slipping away, leaving him with nothing but emptiness and a relentless, haunting shame. Lucas wandered aimlessly through the streets of New York, the once familiar skyline towering over him like a cold, indifferent monolith. He barely recognized himself as he trudged down the bustling sidewalks, avoiding eye contact, trying to ignore the burning hunger gnawing at him. Days had passed since he'd been evicted from his penthouse, and the overwhelming reality of his situation began to weigh him down. With nowhere to go and no one willing to lend a hand, he was a stranger in the city he used to call his own. Lucas had never felt so out of place. He wore the same suit he'd had on the day he was evicted, now wrinkled and stained from sleepless nights spent on public benches. His once polished shoes were scuffed and dirt-covered, his hair, once meticulously styled, was now unkempt, and his face was lined with exhaustion. As he passed the shop windows, he caught glimpses of his reflection, hardly recognizing the hollow, worn-out figure staring back at him. A man who once radiated confidence and pride was now invisible to those around him, just another struggling soul lost in the crowd. The streets were merciless. At first, Lucas tried to maintain some dignity, finding secluded corners to rest, or standing beneath shop awnings to shelter himself from the wind. But soon, fatigue and hunger overtook his pride. He found himself sitting on the ground with his back against a cold brick wall, just another faceless man trying to survive in a city that didn't care. Passers-by avoided looking at him. He could feel their gaze drift past him, their eyes glossing over his presence as if he were invisible. Some even crossed the street to avoid walking too close, their faces twisted with discomfort or disdain. Children held tightly to their parents' hands, casting curious glances before being hurried along. He was no longer Lucas, the successful entrepreneur. He was just another reminder of hardship, someone to be ignored, a cautionary tale in human form. Each day, as he watched people walk by without a hint of compassion, Lucas felt an unsettling realization begin to take shape. He had treated others this way, hadn't he? He remembered moments when he'd seen beggars on the street and had looked past them, unwilling to engage or acknowledge their existence. He had once viewed them as failures, unworthy of his attention or sympathy. Now, here he was, one of them, a man stripped of everything, shunned by the very society he once thought himself superior to. Lucas was forced to confront a side of himself he had always ignored. He had believed himself immune to failure, above the struggles that others faced. Yet here he was, feeling every bit as desperate and vulnerable as those he'd once dismissed. He began to realize the arrogance that had blinded him for so long, the self-righteous belief that he had somehow earned his success, and that those who hadn't were simply undeserving. His heart sank with each passing moment, the bitterness of regret mingling with the pain of hunger and exhaustion. One night, after hours of wandering, Lucas found a bench in a small, quiet park and sat down, pulling his coat tightly around himself against the chill. As he sat there shivering, a group of young men walked past, their laughter echoing through the park. One of them glanced his way, a sneer crossing his face as he muttered something to his friends. Lucas caught the word loser and he winced, feeling a sharp sting of humiliation. Just a few weeks ago, he might have laughed along with them. Now, he was the object of their ridicule, powerless to defend himself. As the hours dragged on, Lucas's pride began to erode, replaced by a raw, gnawing desperation. His stomach growled, his throat dried from lack of water, and the ache in his muscles had grown unbearable. Pride had no place on the streets. It didn't matter how successful he had been, how many luxury cars he had owned, or how many people he had once impressed. Out here, all that mattered was survival, and he was failing at it miserably. One morning, weakened by hunger and a lack of sleep, Lucas found himself standing outside a small cafe, staring longingly through the window at the patrons inside, warm and well-fed. His stomach twisted painfully as he watched a man bite into a sandwich, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the door each time it opened. For a brief moment, he considered asking someone for help, maybe even begging for a little spare change, but the idea made him recoil. He was Lucas Hartwell, wasn't he? Begging was beneath him. Yet, the gnawing hunger and fatigue eventually became too much to bear. As he stood there, wavering on the edge of his own pride, a cafe worker stepped outside to clear some tables, giving Lucas a quick, dismissive glance before throwing some leftovers into the trash. The worker didn't spare him a second look, and Lucas was left with the sting of shame once more. Days turned into a blur of empty sidewalks, cold nights, and endless hunger. The harshness of the streets wore down his last remnants of confidence, his spirit eroded by the unrelenting indifference of the city. Lucas no longer thought of himself as special or above anyone else. He was simply a man desperate for a second chance, struggling to survive one day at a time. It was on one particularly cold evening that Lucas's despair finally reached a breaking point. He had found a small alleyway to huddle in, seeking shelter from the biting wind, when a couple walked past, their eyes briefly meeting his. The woman clutched her purse closer, her expression one of subtle fear and disgust. The man looked away entirely, guiding her down the street without a word. Lucas watched them go, feeling a bitterness rise within him, but he was too drained to hold on to anger. Instead, he sat there, exhausted and hollow, as the reality of his new life settled in. He was not Lucas Hartwell, the young millionaire, anymore. He was just a broken man, lost in the vast, unforgiving streets of New York. In the midst of his despair, Lucas felt a strange, quiet acceptance wash over him. He could no longer ignore the truth of his situation. He was alone, stripped of everything he'd once valued, left to face the harsh world with nothing but the clothes on his back and the memories of a life that now felt like a distant dream. As he sat there contemplating the depths to which he had fallen, he realized with a heavy heart that he was no better than anyone else. The wealth, the success, it had all been an illusion, a fragile facade that had crumbled at the first sign of hardship. And now, for the first time in his life, Lucas understood the weight of humility, the bitter taste of regret, and the humbling realization that he was just as human, just as vulnerable, as the very people he had once scorned. On the 7th day since he lost everything, Lucas's spirit was at an all-time low. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, his body weakened by days of deprivation. His face was gaunt, his clothes disheveled and worn. As he shuffled down a quiet street, his eyes caught sight of a man seated against a brick wall, wrapped in a frayed coat, holding a half-eaten loaf of bread. The man looked up, and their eyes met. The man had a warm, gentle face, his eyes creased with lines that suggested both hardship and wisdom. His hair was graying, his beard unkempt, but there was an undeniable kindness in his gaze. He raised the loaf of bread, nodding towards Lucas with a silent offer. "Hey there, son," the man said, his voice gravelly yet calm. "You look like you could use a bite." Lucas hesitated, his pride flaring up momentarily, but the emptiness in his stomach was more powerful, and before he could stop himself, he found himself inching closer. The man gestured for him to sit beside him, tearing a piece of the bread and extending it. "I'm Ray," the man introduced himself, smiling as he offered Lucas the bread. Lucas took the piece hesitantly, surprised at how ravenously he tore into it. The bread was plain, but in his state, it tasted better than any gourmet meal he'd ever had. "Lucas," he mumbled through a mouthful, barely able to meet Ray's eyes. Ray watched him with a compassionate smile, waiting for Lucas to finish. "It's tough out here, isn't it?" Ray finally said, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't patronizing or pitying, just honest. "I can tell by the way you carry yourself. You're new to this." Lucas glanced at him, a hint of the old pride resurfacing. He wanted to scoff, to deny it, but the weight of his shame and the hunger that still clung to him made it impossible to put up any front. "You could say that," Lucas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Ray nodded knowingly. "I was once in your shoes," he said, his gaze distant, as if he was seeing something from a lifetime ago. "Had a good life, a family, a business of my own, but life has a funny way of taking you down roads you never expect." Intrigued, Lucas looked up. This man, who looked every bit the part of a destitute beggar, had once had it all. The curiosity gnawed at him, and for the first time in days, Lucas felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Ray chuckled softly, the sound tinged with a deep sadness. "Well, let's just say I made some bad choices, trusted the wrong people, and eventually lost everything that mattered to me. It took years before I finally realized that losing it all was what set me free." Lucas frowned, not understanding. "Set you free? How could losing everything possibly do that?" Ray looked at him, his eyes soft but filled with intensity. "Because I had wrapped my whole identity around what I owned. I thought my worth was measured by my bank account, my status, the way people looked at me. But when it was all gone, when there was nothing left to hide behind, I realized I had nothing left to prove either." Lucas sat silently, his mind racing. Ray's words were cutting through the fog of despair he'd been shrouded in, each one resonating deeply. "But how did you survive?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Ray shrugged, his expression calm. "I survived because I had no other choice. But in the process, I discovered something that no amount of money could ever buy: gratitude. Even when I had nothing, I learned to appreciate the smallest things: a kind word, a warm meal, a sunrise. He tore off another piece of bread and handed it to Lucas, his gaze never wavering. I learned that life wasn't about collecting things. It was about connecting with others, even if it's just sharing a piece of bread. Lucas stared down at the bread in his hand, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. This small act of kindness from a man who had almost nothing touched him in a way he couldn't fully grasp. Here was a man who should have been bitter, angry at the world, but instead he had found peace in the very thing Lucas had feared most, losing it all. What about hope? Lucas found himself asking, almost as if testing Ray's philosophy. How can you have hope when you've lost everything? Ray's gaze softened, a gentle smile playing on his lips. Hope isn't something you hold onto like money or possessions, Lucas. It's something you create, something you cultivate every day. And the funny thing about hope, it grows strongest when you have the least. When you're at rock bottom, that's where hope shines brightest, because every little thing becomes a step up, a reason to keep going. Lucas's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the bread. He hadn't felt hope in days, hadn't thought it was even possible to feel anything other than despair. But Ray's words stirred something inside him, a small, fragile spark he didn't even realize was there. Ray leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. You know, Lucas, life can take away everything you have, strip you down to nothing, but it can't take away who you are, unless you let it. You're still you, still Lucas Hartwell. The question is, who do you want to be when there's nothing left to lose? The question struck Lucas with the force of a revelation. Who did he want to be? In his mind, he'd always envisioned himself as a successful, powerful man, someone who commanded respect and admiration. But now, stripped of wealth and status, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The person he thought he was had been built entirely on external validation, on material success. Now, faced with Ray's simple question, he was forced to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. He didn't know who he was without all of it. Ray gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. The world might have taken away everything you owned, son, but it hasn't taken away your ability to choose. You can choose to let this experience make you bitter, or you can let it make you better. The decision is yours. Lucas sat in silence, the weight of Ray's words pressing down on him. All this time, he had been clinging to his past, to the identity he had lost, unable to move forward because he couldn't let go. But Ray's words were like a key, unlocking a door he hadn't known was there. As they sat there, Ray pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Lucas. Listen, if you ever feel like finding out who you can become, come to this address tomorrow morning, he said. It's not much, but it's a place where people help each other, where nobody cares about what you once had or who you once were. They just care that you're here now. Lucas took the paper, staring at the address written in Ray's shaky handwriting. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to start anew. Not as the man he had been, but as someone who could still become something more. Ray got to his feet, stretching before giving Lucas a nod. I'll see you there if you decide to come, he said, before slowly disappearing into the evening shadows. Left alone, Lucas held the paper tightly, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This man, who had nothing to give, had given him the one thing he had thought was lost forever. A reason to believe again. The morning air was sharp and biting as Lucas made his way toward the address on the crumpled piece of paper Ray had given him. He clutched it tightly, feeling an odd mixture of anticipation and hesitation as he neared the destination. It had been a long time since he had felt this way, vulnerable yet hopeful, uncertain but strangely at peace. Ray's words from the previous night still echoed in his mind. You can let this experience make you bitter, or you can let it make you better. The address led him to an unassuming building on the city's east side. The exterior was worn, the bricks chipped and faded, yet there was a warmth about it that Lucas couldn't quite explain. Above the entrance hung a modest sign that read, The Second Chance Center. He stood outside, hesitating. The last vestige of his pride flared up, making him wonder if he was ready to step inside a place where he might have to confront parts of himself he wasn't yet prepared to face. Swallowing his reluctance, Lucas pushed open the door and stepped into the modest lobby. He was greeted by a smiling young woman at the front desk. The simplicity of her greeting, the warmth in her eyes, everything about the place felt different. There was no judgment, no pity, just an atmosphere of acceptance that Lucas hadn't felt in a long time. Good morning, she said. Are you here for breakfast? Caught off guard, Lucas nodded, mumbling a quiet yes. She handed him a small ticket and gestured toward a doorway at the end of the hall. As he made his way down the corridor, Lucas took in the He noticed people from all walks of life, some in worn clothes, some with weary faces, and yet all of them appeared to find comfort here. Inside the dining hall, volunteers served food to those seated at long tables. The aroma of warm oatmeal and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and a gentle hum of quiet conversation echoed around the room. Lucas joined the line, his senses overwhelmed by the kindness and dignity afforded to every person there. It struck him how different this place was from the world he had known, a world that often dismissed people based on their appearance, their wealth, their so-called worth. Here, everyone was on equal ground, no matter their past, no matter what they'd lost. As he reached the front of the line, he looked up and froze. Standing before him, handing out bowls of oatmeal, was Ray. Lucas blinked in disbelief. This was not the frail, downtrodden man he'd shared bread with the night before. Dressed in a clean shirt and apron, Ray stood confidently, a warm smile spreading across his face as he served each person in line. When Ray's eyes met Lucas's, he chuckled. "Didn't expect to see me like this, did you?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Lucas," stammered Lucas. "Ray, this is your place." Ray laughed softly, nodding. "Yes, it is, though I prefer to just call myself a volunteer here. The Second Chance Center has been my life's work for years now." Lucas was stunned. The revelation left him speechless, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the wise, humble beggar from last night with the man standing before him now, guiding a center dedicated to helping others. "But you live on the streets, I thought." Ray smiled knowingly, gesturing for Lucas to follow him to a quieter corner. They sat down, and Ray looked at him with a steady, compassionate gaze. "Lucas's life has a funny way of teaching us the most important lessons in the most unexpected ways. What you see here, this center, it's something I built after I lost everything." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts, then continued. "Years ago I had a family, a business, all the things I thought mattered. But one day, through a series of betrayals and mistakes, I lost it all. For a long time, I wandered, much like you are now. I was angry, bitter, full of resentment. I thought the world owed me something, that I was a victim of everyone else's greed and indifference. But then something changed," Ray went on, his eyes distant as he recalled his past. "I realized that clinging to my anger was only destroying me further. That's when I began helping others in the same situation. It was through acts of kindness, sharing what little I had, that I started to find peace again. And from that peace, I found purpose." Ray's words hit Lucas like a wave, forcing him to confront the bitterness he'd been carrying, the resentment he'd let fester since his fall from grace. He had blamed Marcus, society, his former friends, everyone but himself. But sitting here in the warmth of this humble center, he began to see things through Ray's eyes. "But why do you live on the streets if you run this place?" Lucas finally asked, his voice trembling with confusion. Ray chuckled softly. "Because, Lucas, living on the streets is how I stay close to the people I want to help. I've learned that in order to truly understand others, I need to walk in their shoes, experience what they experience. It's a reminder for me to stay humble, to remember that life's purpose isn't about what I own, but about who I can help." Ray paused, his gaze steady on Lucas. "I live this way because it keeps me grounded. It's a choice I make every single day to embrace humility. Wealth may come and go, but kindness, compassion, and gratitude, those are things that can never be taken from you, no matter how little you have." Lucas's throat tightened. Everything he had ever believed in, all the things he had once valued, seemed trivial now. Here was a man who had lost everything, yet found a purpose so profound that it dwarfed any ambition Lucas had ever known. In that moment, Lucas understood the true value of humility, of kindness, the virtues Ray had been trying to teach him all along. Ray reached across the table, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You've been given a second chance, Lucas. Maybe not in the way you expected, but it's a chance nonetheless. You have the opportunity to redefine yourself, to choose what kind of man you want to be." Lucas felt his defenses crumble. The pride, the arrogance that had once defined him, melted away, replaced by a raw, open humility. He looked around at the people in the center, people he would have once ignored, maybe even scorned, and felt a deep connection to them. For the first time, he understood what Ray had been trying to teach him, that true wealth wasn't found in possessions, but in relationships, in kindness, in the ability to uplift others. Ray offered him a gentle smile, his eyes filled with an unspoken encouragement. "If you ever want to help out here, Lucas, there's always room for another set of hands." Lucas nodded, his voice too choked with emotion to respond. He realized now that he had been given something far greater than a job, a home, or even a fortune. Ray had given him the gift of understanding, a chance to rebuild his life not on the fragile foundation of wealth, but on the enduring strength of compassion and humility. As they rose from the table, Ray handed him a volunteer's apron. Lucas took it, feeling the weight of its meaning, the significance of what it represented. It was a symbol of transformation, of a path forward, a path he was finally ready to walk. Not as the Lucas he once was, but as someone new, someone changed. That night, Lucas stayed to help at the center, serving meals, listening to stories, connecting with others in a way he never had before. In each face he encountered, he saw a reflection of his own journey, a shared humanity that transcended status, wealth, or success. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Hartwell felt whole. The following days were a blur of quiet transformation for Lucas. He arrived each morning at the Second Chance Center, ready to lend a hand and learn from those around him. Instead of the grand, self-centered ambitions that once drove him, Lucas now found fulfillment in simple acts, serving food to people who had lived lives much harder than his, lending an ear to their stories, and learning to see them not as strangers but as reflections of his own journey. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas felt his heart lighten. Each time he shared a meal, each time he offered a warm smile or a comforting word, he felt something profoundly healing. He was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by the new connections he was building. The satisfaction he gained from helping others surpassed anything he had ever experienced in his former life of luxury. It was as if every interaction, every small act of kindness, slowly restored parts of himself he hadn't realized were missing. One crisp morning, as Lucas helped a man settle into a chair with a hot cup of coffee, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a nearby window. He saw a man with purpose and compassion in his eyes, someone he hardly recognized. This was not the arrogant young millionaire who had strutted through life with a dismissive air. This was someone humbled, someone changed. Ray noticed the look on his face and came to sit beside him, chuckling softly. "Looks like you're starting to see it, aren't you?" he asked, his voice warm. "See what?" Lucas replied, though he already knew the answer, that the wealth we carry inside is worth so much more than anything we could ever hold in our hands. Ray said, his eyes twinkling. "Money comes and goes, my friend, but the value you bring to others, that lasts." Lucas felt his throat tighten with emotion. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you, Ray," he finally managed, "for everything. I never would have understood any of this without you." Ray placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, his smile gentle. "It was always there inside you, Lucas. I just helped you find it." In the weeks that followed, Lucas gradually found his footing, taking on more responsibilities at the center. The fear and shame he once felt had faded, replaced by a sense of purpose that was both humbling and deeply fulfilling. Each day brought new challenges, yet he faced them with resilience, feeling strengthened by the small but meaningful difference he made in others' lives. He felt whole, not because of what he possessed, but because of who he was becoming. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the center, Ray approached him with a stack of paperwork. "Lucas," he said, a serious but kind expression on his face, "we could use someone like you here officially. The center is always in need of someone who understands, someone with a heart as big as yours." Lucas blinked, taken aback. He looked down at the papers in his hands, which outlined a job at the center. He felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude and disbelief. In that moment, he realized that this was his second chance, a chance to build a life centered not on accumulating wealth, but on giving back, on connecting with people in ways he had never thought possible. With a steady hand, Lucas signed his name, feeling a sense of belonging and pride he had never known. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned, but it was a life that felt true, one that held meaning beyond any dollar amount or social status. In this modest center, among people who had seen and survived hardships he could barely comprehend, Lucas had found his calling. As the weeks turned into months, Lucas's role at the Second Chance Center expanded. He coordinated meals, organized clothing drives, and even led support groups where he shared his own story, one that had started with loss and ended in transformation. He became a mentor to others, someone they could trust and rely on, a friend who understood their struggles because he had lived them too. One chilly afternoon, a young man walked into the center, his eyes hollow and shoulders slumped with despair. Lucas recognized the same haunted look he had once worn himself. Without hesitation, he approached the man, offering a warm smile and a bowl of soup. As they sat down together, Lucas began to listen, knowing that sometimes the simple act of being heard could make all the difference. In that moment, Lucas felt a profound sense of peace. He no longer yearned for the life he had left behind. He had found something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, of purpose, and of love for humanity that transcended anything he could have bought or sold. Every day at the center, Lucas saw glimpses of his old self in the people who walked through the doors, each of them seeking warmth, compassion, and understanding. And every day he gave freely, knowing that in doing so he was not only helping others but also nurturing the man he had become, a man who understood the true value of kindness, humility, and gratitude. Lucas Hartwell had finally found his second chance, and it was worth more than all the riches in the world, as Lucas's journey shows us. Sometimes the most profound transformations come when we least expect them, when we lose everything we thought we needed, only to discover what truly matters. From wealth to humility, Lucas found purpose, strength, and a new way of living by helping others. His story reminds us all that second chances are often right in front of us. We just have to be open to them. If this story touched you or reminded you of someone you know, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you or someone close to you ever faced a life-changing moment? Your experiences, big or small, can inspire others who may need encouragement today. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes a single act of kindness can be the start of a whole new journey.